In this lecture, we will take a look at some of the components that you can expect to find in a typical computer. So these are basically some of the components that are commonly found in a computer, but obviously there are many more components out there. So the goal for this lecture is going to be to familiarize yourselves with some of the common ones, such as CPU, GPU, memory, motherboard, etc. So let's start with I/O devices, which stand for input and output. So I/O devices are basically any hardware that are used by a human to communicate with a computer. So the most common example would be to interact with a computer. As a source of input, you use what? Your keyboard and your mouse, or in the case of a laptop, it would be a trackpad. And as for the most common form of output, you use a monitor. Obviously there are other input-output devices such as printers, scanners, webcams, etc. Next we have the motherboard. So the motherboard is the main circuit board of the computer, and every other component is in some way connected to the motherboard. So the motherboard is also known as the main board or system board. So this is a typical motherboard. As you can see, there's a lot going on here. These are basically slots that you can use to fit in other components. Then we have memory. So the memory is a part of the computer that stores data related to applications, documents, as well as operating system information. So memory can be of various types, and we have a few pictures of them. In a later chapter, we will take a look at the memory hierarchy. But for the time being, know that this is what is commonly referred to as a hard disk drive, and this is a solid state drive, and this is a dynamic random access memory, which is commonly known as RAM. So dynamic random access memory is what we typically refer to as our primary memory, while SSD and HDD are referred to as secondary form of memory, because typically the operating system information that are currently used, or any applications that are currently used, are stored in your dynamic random access memory, whereas data related to documents, movies, pictures, etc. are typically stored in SSDs or HDDs. So HDDs use mechanical disks to store data, whereas SSDs use flash storage. So these are more vulnerable to damage if you shake them too much or drop them, whereas these are not prone to such vulnerabilities. Also, SSDs are typically much faster, as they do not involve any disks. So the way a hard disk drive writes data is by literally spinning a magnetic disk. Okay, so looks like I wrote mechanical here, it should have been magnetic. Anyways, whereas in the case of an SSD, there are no moving components. Next we have the central processing unit, which is also referred to as the central processor, main processor, or just processor. So I think a common misconception among us is that when we hear the term CPU, we immediately think of this thing here, but this is basically a casing or chassis. So CPU only refers to the central processing unit, which is the brain, basically the soul of your computer. So the CPU is the electronic circuitry that executes your instructions. So we will also take a look at the components that make up a CPU, which include the arithmetic logic unit later. Next we have the graphics processing unit. So not all computers have them, but some do. Actually quite a few do. So the GPU or graphics processing unit is a specialized processor that has been designed to accelerate graphics rendering. So GPUs perform instructions in parallel, which makes them more efficient than general purpose central processing units, or in other words CPUs, for any programs that actually utilize large blocks of data in parallel. So anything that works in parallel instead of sequentially, any task that executes in parallel is usually carried out or executed much faster by using a GPU instead of a CPU. Furthermore, GPUs are used to accelerate machine learning related tasks. Finally, to power everything, obviously you need some source of power, which is known as the power supply. So power supply changes normal household electricity into a suitable one that the computer can use. So this is a snapshot of a power supply unit. And if we go back to our picture of our motherboard, as you can see, this slot here is where our CPU would go in. This is what is known as a PCI Express slot, and here your GPU would be fitted. These are known as RAM slots, and here this is where your primary memory source would go, and these are known as SATA connectors, and here your hard disk drive or SSDs would typically be connected. And this is a battery, which is also known as the CMOS battery, which keeps track of time even when your computer is turned off. So anyways, this is a picture of a fully assembled computer here. This is actually my setup, and this picture is quite old. It was taken in 2017, so some of the components that are shown here actually no longer work. For instance, this is the power supply unit, which unfortunately fried itself a few months ago. Also, one of these are hard drives, and one of these no longer work. So let's see if we can identify all the components that are inside here. So beneath this fan is where the CPU sits, and these are our dynamic random access memories, which serve as the primary memory in our computer. So again, we will learn more about memory in a later chapter. And this is the GPU, which accelerates graphics rendering tasks as well as any ML related tasks. And that's pretty much it. And there are, as you can see, other vacant slots here. So all in all, this is what a typical fully assembled computer looks like. And in the case of a laptop, the same concept holds true as well, only that everything is miniaturized, except for the power supply, which generally is not inside a computer, but instead the power supply is usually outside in the form of a power brick. So anyways, this was a very short lecture. I hope from now on, if anyone mentions any of these components, you'll know what each of them do.